Hey everybody, you're watching ASMR Angel Reads. We are continuing with Daggerspell. Where we left off, Galron's father was putting him in his room where he couldn't escape or do anything, but he figured out how to get out of his room by tricking the guards. And he's escaping right now. Hardly daring to believe his success, Galron raced through the postern gate and kept running until he was well into the silent city. He crouched among some empty ale barrels behind a tavern and caught his breath while he considered his next move. Not the best trick in the world would get him past the guards at the city gate, but the river flowed through the arches in the walls without asking anyone's permission. Cautiously, he stood up and began slipping through the alleys behind the buildings. He was halfway to the river when he heard footsteps behind him. He flung himself into the doorway and crouched in the shadows as a pair of drunken riders from the king's warband staggered past. They weren't more than 2 yards beyond him when one of them burst out singing at the top of his lungs. Galron cursed him and prayed that the city guards wouldn't come running to deal with the nuisance. At last the riders were gone and the street silent again. With a constant eye out for trouble, Galron made his way down to the river bank and waded out to the deep part of the channel. As he let the current take him, he saw far above guards pacing back and forth on the city wall. Closer, closer, the river was sweeping him along fast to the point where they might look down and see him. He held his breath and plunged deep. In the murky water it was hard to see, but he thought he saw the darker stone of the arches sweep by him. His lungs ached. He began to burn like fire, but he forced himself to stay down until the desperate pain drove him, panting and gasping, to the surface. He swung himself over on his back like a seal and barely swam while he breathed in blessed air. The guards in the city both lay far behind him, and no one else was out on the river bank. Galron made his way to the bank and crawled out under the copse of willow trees. Free, he thought. Now all I've got to do is get to Bragawin. Galron, wringing the worst of the water out of his clothes and put them back on damp. The sky told him that he had about 5 hours till dawn. The page wouldn't find May for about another hour after that, and there was bound to be another hour's confusion before the king's warband rode out to hunt him down. It wasn't much of a lead, but if he could only reach the wild forest, they would never find him. He knew the tracks through it, while the riders would be blundering around, making too much noise to surprise any kind of game. Galron set off across the meadows to the neighboring farms and the horse he had in his mind to steal. It was an easy theft. He'd often ridden this way and stopped to admire the sleek bay gelding who remembered his kind words and pats. When Galron approached, the bay came right up and let him take his halter. Since there was no lead rein and no time to steal one, Galron tore the strip of cloth off the bottom of his shirt and prayed that it would hold. The bay was well trained, responding to the touch of the improvised rein along his neck. Galron set off at a gallop down the east-running road. If the king's messenger wasn't already with Geraint, he would reach the Falcon on the morrow. After a few minutes, he slowed the bay to a walk to save its strength. Alternately walking and trotting in short bursts, they traveled all night and reached just at dawn the border of the king's personal demesne. Galron turned south, heading for the wild heath to avoid the well-traveled road. On this roundabout route, it would take longer to reach the forest, but he had no choice. By noon the horse was weary and stumbling under him. Galeron dismounted and led it along until they came to an unkempt woodland at the edge of the pasture land. He found a stream and let the bay drink. It was when the bay began grazing on the grassy bank that Galeron realized he was starving. In his hurry he forgot to bring any coin, nor such as a copper. He could no longer ride up to a noble lord's door and expect to be fed simply because he was a prince. "I'm not quite as clever as I need to be," he said to the horse. "Well, I wonder how you go about stealing food from farmers." The horse needed to rest, and Galeron was weaving with exhaustion. Letting the improvised halter rope trail for the want of a proper tether, he left the horse to its grasp, then sat down with his back to a tree. Although he told himself that he would rest only for one watch of the day, when he awoke it was late in the afternoon and he heard voices nearby. He jumped to his feet and pulled the dagger out of his shirt. "I don't know who it is," the man was saying. "A stolen horse from the look of the bit of cloth." Galeron crept through the trees and came upon a farmer and a young lad who was holding the bay by the halter. When the horse saw Galeron, it nickered out a greeting, and the farmer spun around, raising his heavy staff. "You," he called out, "do you claim this horse?" "I do." Galeron stepped out of the cover. The lad started urging the horse out of the way, but he kept frightening eyes on his father and this dirty, dangerous stranger. When Galeron took a step forward, the farmer dropped to a fighting crouch. Galeron took another step, then another. All at once the farmer laughed and dropped his staff and knelt at the prince's feet. "By the sun and the rays, my liege," the farmer said, "so you're out of the palace. I didn't recognize you at first." "I am out indeed. How do you know so much?" "What's better gossip than the doings of the king? Truly, my prince, the news of your disgrace is all over the marketplace. Everyone's as sad for your mother's sake, and such a good woman and all." "She is at that. Will you help me for her sake? All I ask is a bit of rope for this halter and a meal." "Done, but I've got a bridle to spare." The farmer rose, dusting dead leaves off his knees. "The king's warband rode by on the east road today. The tailor's daughter saw them when she went out to pick violets." The farmer was even better than his word. Not only did he give the prince a bridle and a hot dinner, but he insisted on packing a sack with loaves of bread, dried apples, and oats for the gelding. More food, no doubt, than he could truly spare. When Galeron left at nightfall, he was sure the king's men would hear nothing but lies from the loyal man. It hardly mattered what the farmer would have told them if indeed they did ride his way, because the mid-morning of the next day Galeron led his weary horse into the virgin forest. He found water, gave the horse a meager ration of oats, then sat down to think. He was tempted simply to go to Rhaegar and let Bragawin think what she liked about him, but he had the distinct feeling that Rhaegar would be furious. For the first time in his pampered life, Galeron knew what it was to fail. He'd been a fool, dishonorable, plain, and simply stupid. He cursed himself with every insult he could think of. Around him the forest stretched silent, dappling with sunlight, indifferent to him and his short-lived human worries. Husbanding every scrap of food, scrounging what fodder he could for his horse, Galeron made his way east through the forest for 2 days. He stayed close to the road and tried to calculate where the Falcon's party might be, because he'd made up his mind to intercept it. Late one afternoon, he risked coming out onto the road and riding up to the crest of the low hill. Far away, hanging over the road, was a faint pall of dust. Horses coming. Hurriedly, he pulled back into the forest and waited, but the Falcon's party never rode past. With Bragawin and her maidservant along, they would be making early camp to spare the women's strength. As it grew dark, Galeron led the bay through the forest and worked his way toward the camp. From the top of the next hill he saw it, not just Lord Garen and his retainers, but the king's entire warband. May every god curse them, Galeron whispered. They knew she'd be the best bait to draw me. Galeron tied his horse securely in the woods, then ran across the road and began making his cautious way to the camp. Every snap of the twig under his foot made him freeze and wait. Halfway down the hill, the trees thinned somewhat, giving him a good look at the sprawling, disorganized camp. In the clearing along the stream, the horses were tethered nearby. The warband was gathered around 2 fires. Off to one side, among the trees, stood the high-peaked canvas tent, doubtless for Bragawin's privacy away from the ill-mannered riders. The true and dangerous question, of course, was where Geraint might be. The firelight below shone too dim for Galeron to make out anyone's face. He lay flat in the underbrush and watched until, after about an hour, a blond man came out of the tent and strolled over to one of the fires. No man but her brother would have been allowed in the tent in the first place. As soon as Geraint was safely occupied with his dinner, Galeron got up, drawing his dagger, then circled through the underbrush, moving downhill and heading for the tent. The warband was laughing and talking, making blessed noise to cover his approach. Galeron slit the tent down the back with his dagger. A rip of the taut cloth, he heard someone moving inside. Galeron? Bragawin whispered. It is. Galeron slipped back into cover, wearing only her long nightdress and her golden hair loose over her shoulders. Bragawin crawled out of the rip and crept to join him. I knew you'd come for me, she whispered. We've got to go right now. Ah, ye gods, will you come with me? Did you ever doubt it? I'd follow you anywhere. I don't care what you've done. But you don't even have a scrap of extra clothing. Do you think that matters to me? Galeron felt as if he'd never truly looked at her before. His poor weak child, grinning like a berserker at the thought of riding away with an exile. Forgive me, Galeron said. Come along, I've got a horse. Then Galeron heard the sound, the softest crack of a branch. Run, Bragawin screamed. Galeron swirled around, too late. The guards sprang out of the trees and circled him like a common stag. Galeron dropped to a fighting crouch, raised his dagger, and promised himself he'd get one of them before he died. A man shoved his way through the pack of guards. That'll do you no good, lad, Atarock said. Galeron straightened up. He could never kill his own father. When he threw the dagger onto the ground at Atarock's feet, the king stooped to retrieve it. His smile was as cold as the winter wind. Galeron heard Bragawin beyond him, weeping in long sobs, and Geraint's voice murmuring as he tried to comfort her. Nothing like a birch to bring a dog to heel, Atarock remarked. Bring him round to the fire. I want to look at this cub of mine. The guards marched Galeron around the tent and over to the bigger campfire where the king took up his stance, feet spread apart, hands on his hips. When someone brought Bragawin a cloak, she wrapped it around her and stared hopelessly at Galeron. Geraint laid a heavy hand on her shoulder and drew her close. So, you little whelp, Atarock said, what do you have to say for yourself? Naught, father. I'll only ask you for a single boon. What makes you think you have the right to ask for any? Atarock drew his own dagger and began to fiddle with it as he talked. No right at all, but I'm asking for my lady's sake. Send her away out of sight before you kill me. Fair enough. Granted. Bragawin screamed and shoved Geraint so hard he stumbled and ran forward to throw herself at the king's feet. Please, please, Bragawin went on. For the sake of his mother, I beg you, if you must have blood, take mine. Bragawin clutched the hem of the king's shirt and turned up her throat to him. She was so beautiful, with her hair streaming down her shoulders, with tears running down her perfect face, that even the king's riders sighed aloud in pity for her. Ah, ye gods, Atarak said, do you love this lout as much as that? I do. I'd go with him anywhere, even to the other lands. Atarak glanced at the dagger, then sheathed it with a sigh. Garrett, the king bellowed. Garrett came forward, took Bragawin by the shoulders, and tried to lead her away, but she shook him off. Galron was so sick he could barely stand. He was unworthy of her, or so he saw it, and this second failure shattered him. Well, by the hills, Atarak said mildly, if I can't slit your throat, Galaron, how am I going to solve this little matter? You could let me and my lady go into exile. It would spare us all much trouble. You little bastard, Atarak stepped forward and slapped him across the face. How dare you? Galaron staggered from the force of the blow, but he held his ground. Do you want me to tell everyone else what this quarrel between us is all about? Do you, father? I will. Atarak went still as he hunted. Atarak went as still as a hunted animal. Or shall I just accept exile? Galaron went on, and no man need know of the cause of it. You bastard, Atarak whispered so low that Galaron could barely hear him. Oh, truly not a bastard, because of all my sons you're the one most like me. Then he raised his voice. The cause need not be known, but we hereby do pronounce our son Galaron as stripped of all rank and honor, as turned out of our presence and our demesnes forever and beyond forever. We forbid him our lands, we forbid him the shelter of those sworn as loyal vassals, all on the pain of death. He paused to laugh under his breath. And we hereby strip him of the name we gave him at his miserable birth. We proclaim his new name as Nevin. Do you hear me, lad? Nevin. No one. Nobody at all. That's your new name. Done. I'll wear it proudly. Bragawin shook herself free of Garen's arm. She smiled so proudly as the prince she might have been as she stared over to the banished man. Galaron held out his hand to her. Hold, Garrett forced himself between them. My liege, my king, what is this? Am I to marry my only sister to exile? She's my betrothed already, Galaron snapped. Your father pledged her, not you. Hold your tongue, Nevin, Atarak slapped him across the face. My lord Garrett, you have our leave to speak. My liege, as he knelt before the king, Garrett was shaking. Truly my father pledged her, and as his son all I can do is honor his pledge. But my father betrothed her to a good life, one of comfort and honor. He loved his daughter. What will she have now? As Atarak considered, Galaron felt the Dwemer warning like ice shuddering down his back. He stepped forward. Father. Never call me that again, Atarak motioned to the guards. Keep our no one here quiet. Before Galaron could dodge, two men grabbed him and twisted his arms behind him. One of them clipped a firm hand over his mouth. Bragawin stood frozen, her face so pale that Galaron was afraid she would faint. I beg you, my liege, Garen went on, if I allow this marriage, what kind of brother am I? How can I claim to be head of my clan if I have so little honor? My liege, if ever the falcon has paid you any service, I beg you, don't let this happen. Done then, Atarak said. We hereby release you from your father's pledge. Garrow, Bragawin sobbed out. You can't. I want to go. Garrow, let me go. Hush, Garrett rose, turning and sweeping her into his arms. You don't understand. You don't know what kind of life you will have, wandering the roads like a beggar. I don't care, Bragawin tried to struggle free. Garrow, how can you do this to me? Let me go. Garrett weakened, then he tossed his head. I won't have you die in childbirth someday just because your man doesn't have the price of a midwife or starve some winter on the road. I'll die first myself. It was touching, perfectly said, but Galron knew that Garrett was lying, that all those fine words were cruel, deadly, poison lies. The dreamer was making him tremble and choke. He bit his guard into his hand, but all he got for his efforts was a blow to the back of the head that made the world dance. You're wrong, Garrow, Bragawin struggled like a wild creature. I know you're wrong. I want to go with him. Right or wrong, I'm the falcon now, and you're not disobeying me. Bragawin made one last wrench, but he was too strong for her. As he dragged her away bodily, she wept, sobbing hysterically and helplessly as Garrett shoved her into her tent. Adarok motioned to the guards to let Galron go. Get this Nevin out of my sight forever, the king handed Galron a dagger. Here's the one weapon allowed to a banished man. You must have a horse or you wouldn't be here. He took the pouch at his side and drew out a coin. And here's a silver, a banished man. He pressed the coin into Galron's hand. Galron glanced at it, then flung it to his father's face. I'd rather starve. As the guards fell back in front of him, Galron strode out of the camp. At the top of the rise, he turned for a last look at Bragawin's tent. Then he broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush, running across the road, and tripping at last to fall on his knees near the bay gelding. He wept for Bragawin's sake, not his own. That's it for today. We got a good chunk of the book through. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye.